In a quiet community park, a simple game of soccer turns into a moment that changes everything for 10-year-old Isaiah Morgan and his mother, Danielle. What begins as an afternoon of carefree play becomes the spark for a movement that will challenge a system and inspire a community. This is a story about courage in the face of bias, a mother's unwavering fight for justice, and a young boy finding his voice against all odds. But what really happened that day? How did one small moment ripple into a call for change? Stick around to uncover the truth, the triumphs, and the lessons we can all take from Isaiah's journey. If you're ready to be inspired, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments, what does justice mean to you? Let's start a conversation. Now let's dive into the story. The late afternoon sun painted a golden glow across Liberty Park, a popular urban escape in Fairview, Illinois. Children's laughter rang out over the rhythmic creak of swings, and parents chatted on benches, sharing warm smiles. Among them was 10-year-old Isaiah Morgan, a boy who seemed to radiate joy. His oversized soccer ball bounced ahead of him, a familiar companion in his small but vibrant world. Isaiah's mother, Danielle Morgan, was a pillar of the community and a respected family court judge. Known for her fairness and compassion, Danielle had worked tirelessly to uphold justice in her courtroom. At home, however, she found it harder to balance her demanding career and parenting. That afternoon, Isaiah finally convinced his mother to let him go to the park alone. "I'll stay close, Mama," he promised, his big brown eyes full of earnest determination. "You don't have to worry." Danielle had hesitated, but relented. "Just be careful," she said, her voice firm but loving. "And call me if you need anything." Isaiah dashed off with his ball, his scuffed sneakers kicking up little puffs of dust on the sidewalk. For him, the park was freedom, a slice of heaven where he could pretend to be a soccer star, scoring the game-winning goal. At the edge of the park, Officer Clint Harlow sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd with an air of detachment. The day had been uneventful, and Harlow found himself restless. When his gaze landed on Isaiah, something stirred a vague irritation he couldn't name. The boy didn't seem to belong. His worn clothes and carefree demeanor felt out of place among the well-dressed families enjoying the park. Harlow muttered to himself, "What's this kid up to?" He watched as Isaiah chased his soccer ball, oblivious to the officer's scrutiny. Probably trouble waiting to happen, Harlow thought. Isaiah, unaware of Harlow's focus, played with abandon. He kicked the ball high, trying to mimic his favorite soccer player's signature move. When the ball rolled toward the edge of the park, Isaiah jogged after it, smiling as he imagined the cheers of an imaginary crowd. As he bent to pick up the ball, he heard a voice sharp and authoritative. "Hey kid, what do you think you're doing?" Isaiah turned, startled, to find Harlow standing a few feet away. The officer's imposing figure loomed over him, his hand resting casually on his belt. Just playing soccer," Isaiah said, his voice small. Harlow frowned. "Where are your parents? You live around here?" "Yes, sir," Isaiah replied, clutching the ball to his chest. "My mom said I could come." Harlow's tone grew sharper. "Is that so? What's your name, kid?" "Isaiah," he answered hesitantly, feeling the weight of the officer's gaze. Harlow leaned in slightly. "Well, Isaiah, it's my job to keep this park safe. You're not causing trouble, are you?" Isaiah shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir." The interaction, though brief, left Isaiah shaken. He hurried back to the field, his joy replaced by unease. Harlow watched him for a moment longer before returning to his car, his mind clouded with vague justifications for his actions. Meanwhile, across town, Danielle was finishing her workday. She glanced at her phone, half expecting a call from Isaiah. The silence reassured her, but a nagging worry lingered. At the park, Isaiah tried to shake off his encounter with Harlow. He returned to his game, but the ball felt heavier, and the laughter of nearby children seemed distant. He couldn't explain it, but the officer's words replayed in his mind, leaving him unsettled. Harlow, still parked at the edge of the park, occasionally glanced in Isaiah's direction. Though no wrongdoing was apparent, he felt a need to remain vigilant. His assumptions about the boy had taken root, coloring every movement with suspicion. As the sun began to set, Isaiah decided it was time to head home. He tucked the ball under his arm and started toward the gate, his steps slower than usual. Unbeknownst to Isaiah, his encounter with Harlow hadn't gone unnoticed. A bystander, Ryan Cole, had observed the interaction and found it unsettling. Pulling out his phone, he recorded a short video and uploaded it to a community forum with the caption, "Why is this boy being harassed for playing soccer?" The video quickly gained traction. Within hours, it spread across social media, sparking outrage. Comments poured in, questioning the officer's behavior and expressing sympathy for Isaiah. By the time Danielle arrived home, she had a dozen missed calls and an anonymous message containing the video. As she watched it, her heart sank. Seeing Isaiah's nervous responses to Harlow's pointed questions filled her with a mix of anger and sorrow. That night, Danielle sat with Isaiah at the kitchen table. She gently asked about his day, carefully avoiding any mention of the video. "It was okay," Isaiah said, his eyes fixed on the table. But when Danielle pressed him, his composure faltered. "The officer, he kept asking me questions like I did something wrong," he admitted, his voice trembling. Danielle reached across the table, taking his small hand in hers. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said firmly. "You have every right to be in that park." Isaiah nodded, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. As he went to bed, Danielle sat alone in the living room, staring at the video on her phone. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to let this incident go unanswered. That night, Isaiah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Shadows from the tree outside danced on the walls, but instead of finding comfort in their familiar shapes, he felt uneasy. His mind replayed the interaction with Officer Harlow, trying to make sense of it. Why had the officer assumed he was doing something wrong? Was it because he looked different from most of the other kids at the park? Isaiah wasn't sure, but the thought made his chest tighten. He hugged his pillow close, wishing for the carefree feeling he'd had earlier that afternoon. But the laughter and warmth of the park felt like a distant memory, replaced by Harlow's sharp words and the cold look in his eyes. Downstairs, Danielle sat in the dimly lit kitchen, her laptop open in front of her. The video of Isaiah's encounter with Harlow played on repeat, though she could barely bring herself to watch it again. Each time she heard Isaiah's soft voice trembling as he answered the officer's questions, a pang of guilt cut through her. She had always taught Isaiah to be respectful, to follow the rules, and to speak politely to authority figures. Yet none of that had mattered. Danielle's phone buzzed with notifications. Messages from colleagues and friends poured in, offering support or sharing their outrage about the video. One message stood out, though, a text from her sister, Renee, a community organizer who had spent years fighting for racial equity. "This is bigger than Isaiah, Danny. Let me know how I can help." Danielle stared at the message, torn. She didn't want Isaiah to become the center of a public spectacle, but she also couldn't ignore the implications of what had happened. Finally, she replied, "I need time to think. I'll call you tomorrow." Isaiah came down to breakfast the next day, his usual cheerfulness subdued. Danielle noticed the way he avoided meeting her eyes and the hesitation in his steps. "Good morning, baby," she said, keeping her tone light. "What do you want for breakfast?" "Just cereal," Isaiah mumbled, sliding into his chair. Danielle poured him a bowl, sitting down across from him. "Isaiah, about yesterday," he froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. "What about it?" "I saw a video," Danielle said gently. "Someone recorded what happened with the officer." Isaiah's face fell. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry you had to go through that," Danielle continued, reaching for his hand. "You didn't deserve it. None of that was your fault." Isaiah shrugged, his voice small. "It's okay. He didn't hurt me or anything." "That doesn't make it okay," Danielle said firmly. "What he did wasn't right, and I want you to know that. You have every right to feel upset." Isaiah nodded, but his expression remained guarded. Danielle decided not to push him further, resolving instead to let him process his feelings at his own pace. Across town, Officer Harlow sat in his patrol car, scrolling through his phone during a break. His feed was flooded with posts about the video, each one more critical than the last. "Officer Harlow's behavior is unacceptable," one post read. "He clearly profiled that boy. Justice for Isaiah. Another comment said, "This is why we need police reform. Kids shouldn't feel unsafe in a park." Harlow clenched his jaw, tossing his phone onto the passenger seat. The criticism stung, but not because he thought it was justified. To him, the public was blowing things out of proportion. "I was just doing my job," he muttered to himself. "People don't understand how hard it is out here." Yet, deep down, a small voice whispered doubts he wasn't ready to face. Had he acted out of line? Was it possible that his assumptions about Isaiah had been unfair? Harlow quickly pushed the thought aside. He wasn't about to let social media dictate how he felt about his work. As the video continued to circulate, the community began to organize. Renee reached out to local leaders, including a pastor, a youth advocate, and a retired police captain, to discuss the incident. They planned a town hall meeting to address concerns about racial profiling and policing practices. Danielle reluctantly agreed to attend. She wasn't sure how much she wanted to share about Isaiah's experience, but she knew the issue was too important to ignore. Meanwhile, Isaiah overheard snippets of conversations between his mother and Renee. Words like systemic bias and reform floated through the air, but they felt distant and abstract. For Isaiah, the situation wasn't about systems or policies, it was about how he felt when Harlow looked at him, like he didn't belong. That afternoon, Danielle received an unexpected call from Captain Denise Walker, a retired officer who had worked in the same precinct as Harlow years ago. "Judge Morgan," Denise said, her voice steady but warm, "I saw the video. I wanted to let you know that not all officers are like Harlow. What he did was wrong, and it needs to be addressed." Danielle was surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Captain Walker. I appreciate your support. I'm actually working with a group that pushes for accountability within the department," Denise continued. "If you're open to it, I'd like to help in any way I can." Danielle hesitated for a moment before replying. "I'd like that. Thank you." A few days later, Isaiah tentatively asked Danielle if he could go back to the park. "Are you sure?" Danielle asked, concern evident in her tone. "I think so," Isaiah said. "I don't want to be scared to go there." Danielle decided to accompany him, sitting on a nearby bench as he kicked his soccer ball around. At first, Isaiah felt self-conscious, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. But as the minutes passed, the familiar rhythm of the ball against his feet began to soothe him. By the time they left, Isaiah felt a little lighter. It wasn't a full return to normal, but it was a step in the right direction. The auditorium of Fairview Community Center buzzed with activity as residents filled the seats. Flyers announcing the town hall had circulated throughout the neighborhood, promising a discussion on community safety and racial bias in policing. Danielle Morgan sat in the front row, flanked by her sister Renee and Captain Denise Walker. Isaiah sat beside her, fidgeting nervously. Danielle had debated whether to bring him, but Isaiah had insisted. "I want to hear what they say, Mama," he had said with quiet determination. The moderator, Pastor Lawrence Avery, opened the meeting with a somber tone. "We are here tonight because of what happened to a young boy in our community," he said, gesturing toward Isaiah. "But this isn't just about him. This is about all of us and the kind of future we want to build for our children." The crowd murmured in agreement. Renee was the first to speak, her voice clear and commanding. She recounted Isaiah's experience and emphasized the broader issue of systemic bias. "What happened to my nephew isn't an isolated incident," she said. "It's part of a pattern, and we need to address it now." Next, Captain Walker shared her perspective as a retired officer. "Accountability doesn't weaken policing, it strengthens it," she said. "We can't protect and serve if communities don't trust us." As the floor opened for questions, the atmosphere grew tense. Some residents expressed anger and frustration, while others shared personal stories of being profiled or mistreated. Then a man in the back raised his hand. Eric Calloway, a local business owner, asked, "What's being done to make sure this doesn't happen again?" "Words are good, but we need action." Danielle stood, her voice steady but resolute. "We're pursuing accountability for the officer involved," she said. "But this is also about creating systemic change. We need better training, independent oversight, and policies that ensure fairness and equality." Her words were met with applause, but Isaiah noticed a few skeptical faces in the crowd. Meanwhile, Officer Clint Harlow sat in his supervisor's office, arms crossed defensively. The video of his interaction with Isaiah had sparked an internal investigation, and he was summoned to answer questions. "I didn't do anything wrong," Harlow said firmly. "I was just doing my job." Chief Walter Simmons, a grizzled veteran nearing retirement, sighed. "Clint, this isn't just about you. That video's a problem for the entire department." "What was I supposed to do? Ignore him?" Harlow asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "You were supposed to exercise better judgment," Simmons replied. "We're putting you on administrative leave while this is sorted out." Harlow's jaw tightened. "You're throwing me under the bus." "No," Simmons said quietly. "You put yourself here." As Harlow left the office, his mind raced. The scrutiny was suffocating, but he clung to the belief that he was being unfairly targeted. Over the following days, the hashtag Justice for Isaiah continued to gain traction. Local news stations picked up the story, and national outlets soon followed. Activists called for systemic reforms, including bias training for officers and independent investigations into police misconduct. Isaiah's face appeared in articles and news segments, often alongside captions like "the boy who sparked a movement." Danielle shielded him from most of the coverage, but she couldn't prevent the whispers at school or the lingering stares at the grocery store. One afternoon, Isaiah confided in Danielle. "Why do they care so much about me, Mama?" Danielle knelt in front of him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Because what happened to you shouldn't happen to anyone," she said. "And because your story is helping people see what needs to change." The growing movement wasn't without backlash. Some residents argued that the incident was being overblown, while others defended Harlow, claiming he was being vilified for doing his job. One local business put up a sign reading, "We support our police. Stop the witch hunt." The sign sparked outrage, leading to a protest outside the store. Danielle decided not to attend, but Renee joined, delivering a fiery speech about the need for accountability. Isaiah, watching the protest on TV, felt a mix of emotions. He was proud of his aunt, but also overwhelmed by the attention. Determined to channel the public momentum into meaningful change, Danielle met with Marcus Turner, a lawyer from a civil rights organization. Together, they discussed filing a formal complaint against the police department, citing systemic bias. "This isn't just about one officer," Marcus said. "It's about a culture that allows these things to happen." Danielle agreed, though the thought of taking on the police department felt daunting. "What about Isaiah?" she asked. "I don't want this to hurt him more than it already has." "We'll protect him as much as we can," Marcus assured her. "But his story is powerful, Danielle. It can make a real difference." Despite Danielle's efforts to protect him, Isaiah couldn't escape the weight of the incident. At school, classmates bombarded him with questions. "What was it like? Were you scared?" Isaiah often didn't know how to answer. One day, after a particularly intrusive question, he snapped, yelling at a classmate and storming out of the room. When Danielle picked him up, his teacher, Ms. Peterson, pulled her aside. "Isaiah's been having a hard time," she said gently. "I think he needs someone to talk to." That evening, Danielle sat with Isaiah on the couch. "Baby, would you want to talk to a counselor?" she asked. Isaiah shrugged. "I don't know. It's okay to need help," Danielle said softly. "You've been through a lot." After a long pause, Isaiah nodded. "Okay." While Isaiah began therapy, Harlow faced increasing isolation. His fellow officers were split. Some supported him, while others distanced themselves, wary of being associated with the controversy. Harlow's lawyer, Victor Graham, advised him to remain silent publicly, but prepared him for the possibility of a civil suit. "We'll argue that you acted within protocol," Graham said, "but you need to be ready for a fight." Harlow nodded, though a gnawing doubt had begun to creep into his mind. He replayed the encounter with Isaiah, wondering if there had been another way to handle it. One evening, Danielle took Isaiah back to the park, hoping to reclaim the space as a place of joy. This time, they brought along Isaiah's friend, Evan, who had been a source of support at school. The boys kicked the soccer ball back and forth, their laughter filling the air. For a moment, the park felt like it used to safe and full of possibility. As Danielle watched, she felt a glimmer of hope. Isaiah's resilience was a reminder of why she was fighting, not just for him, but for every child who deserved to grow up without fear. The Fairview Police Department launched an internal review of Officer Clint Harlow's actions after public pressure mounted. Lieutenant Sarah Boyd, head of Internal Affairs, was tasked with leading the inquiry. Lieutenant Boyd conducted interviews with Harlow and his colleagues. Harlow, though defensive, insisted he had done nothing wrong. "I acted based on my training," he repeated, his tone clipped. Boyd pressed him. "Do you feel your actions were appropriate, considering the child had done nothing to indicate he was a threat?" Harlow hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. I thought he might have been up to something. You never know these days." "That's the problem, Officer Harlow," Boyd replied, her tone sharp. "You acted on a hunch, not evidence. And that's not what we train for." Isaiah's first therapy session was quiet. He sat across from Dr. Amelia Pierce, a warm, soft-spoken therapist with a calm demeanor. She began with simple questions, asking about his favorite hobbies and school subjects. Isaiah was hesitant at first, answering with single words. But as the session progressed, Dr. Pierce gently encouraged him to share his feelings about the park incident. "I didn't do anything wrong," Isaiah said, his voice breaking. "But he looked at me like I was a bad kid." "That must have been really scary," Dr. Pierce said empathetically. Isaiah nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Why did he think that about me?" Dr. Pierce didn't offer a simple answer, knowing the truth was complex. Instead, she reassured him. "What happened wasn't your fault, Isaiah. Sometimes people make assumptions, and those assumptions are wrong. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you." Isaiah left the session feeling a little lighter. It was a small step, but an important one. As the investigation into Harlow continued, public opinion became increasingly polarized. Protests demanding accountability grew larger, with signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Isaiah" and "End Racial Profiling." Meanwhile, counter-protests emerged, with supporters of Harlow holding signs that read, "Support our police," and "Enough with the witch hunts." Danielle was careful to shield Isaiah from the more inflammatory rhetoric. However, she couldn't stop him from overhearing snippets of conversations or seeing headlines at the grocery store. One evening, as they watched TV together, Isaiah turned to his mother. "Why do some people think the officer was right?" Danielle sighed, struggling to find the right words. "Sometimes people don't want to admit when something is wrong," she said. "It's easier to defend the way things are than to work toward change." Isaiah thought about this for a moment before asking, "Do you think they'll ever listen?" "I think they will," Danielle said firmly, "because people like you are showing them why they need to." Captain Denise Walker continued her efforts to push for reform within the department. She met with Chief Walter Simmons and other department heads, presenting recommendations for bias training and increased oversight. "This isn't just about one incident," Walker said during a meeting. "It's about rebuilding trust with the community." Chief Simmons, though initially resistant, began to see the writing on the wall. Public scrutiny wasn't going away, and ignoring the issue could have long-term consequences for the department. "I'll bring your recommendations to the city council," Simmons said reluctantly. "But you'd better be ready for pushback." "I've been ready," Walker replied. As word of Isaiah's story spread, his school invited him to speak at an assembly on fairness and respect. At first, Isaiah was hesitant. "What if I mess up?" he asked Danielle the night before. "You won't," Danielle assured him. "Just tell your story. That's all you need to do." Standing on the stage in front of his classmates, Isaiah's hands trembled. But when he began to speak, his voice grew steady. "I was just playing soccer at the park," he said, "and the officer thought I was doing something wrong, even though I wasn't. It made me feel small, like I didn't belong." He paused, glancing at the audience. "But my mom told me that wasn't true. And I want everyone to know it's okay to stand up for yourself. And it's okay to ask for help when things feel unfair." The students erupted into applause, and Isaiah felt a surge of pride. During his administrative leave, Harlow attended mandatory counseling sessions as part of the department's policy. At first, he resisted, treating the sessions as a formality. But during one session, his therapist asked, "Clint, why do you think you approached that boy in the park?" "I thought he might have been causing trouble," Harlow said defensively. "Why?" the therapist pressed. "What about him made you think that?" Harlow hesitated, uncomfortable with the question. "I don't know. Maybe Maybe I assumed because of how he looked. That assumption hurt him, the therapist said gently. And it's something worth thinking about. For the first time, Harlow began to question his actions. It was an uncomfortable realization, but it planted a seed of self-reflection. As the town hall meetings continued, the community began drafting a list of demands for the police department. These included mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and a review of past complaints against officers. Danielle, though hesitant to take on a public role, became a key figure in the movement. Her calm, articulate speeches resonated with both activists and city officials. "This isn't about punishing one officer," she said during a city council meeting. "It's about creating a system that protects everyone, especially our children." Isaiah's therapy sessions and the support of his family helped him regain his confidence. One afternoon, while playing soccer with his friend Evan, he shared something he hadn't admitted before. "I didn't want to go back to the park at first," Isaiah said. "I was scared he might come back." "But you did," Evan pointed out. "That's brave." Isaiah smiled, realizing his friend was right. "Yeah, I guess it is." The courtroom was packed on the first day of the hearing. Reporters jostled for seats, activists gathered outside, and the Morgan family sat quietly in the front row. Isaiah fidgeted beside Danielle, his nerves evident. The case wasn't criminal. Officer Clint Harlow faced a civil suit filed by Danielle with the support of a prominent civil rights organization. The lawsuit accused Harlow and the Fairview Police Department of negligence and racial bias, seeking accountability and systemic reform. Danielle's lawyer, Marcus Turner, delivered a powerful opening statement. "This is not about punishing one officer," he began. "This is about justice for Isaiah Morgan and every child who has ever felt less than safe because of assumptions based on their appearance." Harlow's defense attorney, Victor Graham, countered with a calculated argument. "Officer Harlow was acting within the bounds of his training," he said. "His intent was never malicious, and this case is a misrepresentation of his actions." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution called its first witness, Ryan Cole, the bystander who had recorded the video. Ryan recounted what he had seen that day at the park. "The officer's tone was aggressive from the start," Ryan said. "Isaiah was just a kid playing soccer, and it was clear he hadn't done anything wrong." The defense tried to undermine Ryan's credibility, suggesting he had a bias against law enforcement. But Ryan remained steadfast. "This isn't about being against the police," he said firmly. "It's about standing up for what's right." Next, the prosecution called Captain Denise Walker, who testified about systemic issues within the department. "There's a lack of accountability," Walker said. "Complaints are often dismissed without proper investigation, which allows biases to persist unchecked." Her testimony was a damning indictment of the department's culture. When Isaiah was called to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Danielle's heart pounded as she watched her son climb into the witness chair, his small frame dwarfed by its size. Marcus approached him gently. "Isaiah, can you tell us what happened that day at the park?" Isaiah hesitated, glancing at his mother before answering. "I was playing soccer," he said softly, "and the officer came over and started asking me questions. He sounded really mad." "What did you feel in that moment?" Marcus asked. "I felt scared," Isaiah admitted, his voice breaking. "I didn't know what I did wrong." The defense cross-examined Isaiah, attempting to cast doubt on his recollection of events. But Isaiah's quiet honesty was unshakable. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "I just wanted to play." When it was time for Clint Harlow to testify, he looked uneasy. His lawyer had coached him to stay calm and measured, but the weight of public scrutiny seemed to bear down on him. "I approached the boy because I thought something was off," Harlow said. "I've seen kids his age get into trouble before, and I didn't want anything to happen." Marcus pressed him. "What exactly about Isaiah seemed off to you, Officer Harlow?" Harlow struggled to answer. "He didn't look like most of the kids in the park." "And what do you mean by that?" Marcus asked, his tone sharp. Harlow shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Maybe I made a mistake." "Maybe," Marcus pressed. "Or did you assume something about Isaiah because of the color of his skin?" Harlow didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. As the trial progressed, new evidence came to light. Marcus presented an internal memo from the police department that detailed previous complaints against Harlow, including allegations of racial bias. This memo shows that the department was aware of Officer Harlow's pattern of behavior and failed to act, Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. This isn't just about one incident, it's about a system that allowed it to happen. The defense scrambled to counter the revelation, but the damage was done. Marcus delivered a powerful closing argument, tying together the testimonies and evidence into a compelling narrative. This case isn't about destroying an officer's career, he said. It's about ensuring that no child has to grow up feeling like they don't belong in their own community. Isaiah Morgan was just a boy playing soccer, and yet he was treated like a suspect because of assumptions that have no place in a just society. Victor Graham, for the defense, leaned on the argument of reasonable doubt. Officer Harlow acted within the scope of his duties, he argued. While mistakes may have been made, they were not malicious. The jury listened intently, their expressions unreadable. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Danielle held Isaiah's hand, her grip firm but comforting. The foreperson stood, her voice steady. On the charge of negligence, we find the defendant liable. On the charge of racial discrimination, we find the defendant liable. A wave of relief swept through the courtroom. Danielle closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "We did it, baby." The verdict sparked widespread reactions. Activists celebrated the decision as a step toward accountability, while Harlow's supporters decried it as unfair. Harlow was dismissed from the police force and required to undergo extensive bias training and community service. The police department also agreed to implement reforms, including mandatory bias training and the creation of an independent oversight committee. For Isaiah, the journey wasn't over. He continued therapy to process the trauma, but the verdict gave him a sense of closure. One evening, as he and Danielle walked through the park, Isaiah paused by a newly installed plaque that read, "In honor of those who fight for justice and equality." He turned to his mother. "Do you think things will really change?" "They already are," Danielle said, her voice full of hope. As the trial gained national attention, the community of Fairview became a focal point for discussions about justice, equality, and systemic change. Outside the courthouse, activists held peaceful demonstrations. Signs reading "Justice for Isaiah" and "Accountability Now" dotted the landscape. Among the demonstrators was Pastor Lawrence Avery, who led a prayer circle each morning before proceedings began. "Let's remember," he told the crowd, "this fight is not about revenge. It's about creating a better world for all our children." Isaiah watched the news coverage from home, feeling a strange mix of pride and pressure. He turned to his mother. "What if they lose, Mama?" Danielle knelt beside him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Baby, we've already won in some ways," she said. "People are talking about things they used to ignore. That's because of you." Midway through the trial, Marcus Turner presented an unexpected witness, Harold Whitaker, a retired officer who had served in the same precinct as Clint Harlow. Whitaker's testimony would prove to be a turning point. Taking the stand, Whitaker looked weary but resolute. "I saw things during my years on the force," he began, "things that didn't sit right with me. And I regret not speaking up sooner." "What kind of things?" Marcus asked. Whitaker sighed, glancing briefly at Harlow. There were patterns certain officers treating kids from minority communities differently. Harlow was one of them. "I reported it once, but it got buried. Nobody wanted to deal with the paperwork." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Whitaker's words reinforced the idea that Harlow's actions weren't isolated but part of a broader issue. The defense tried to discredit Whitaker, suggesting he was biased or bitter. But Whitaker remained steadfast. "I'm here because it's the right thing to do," he said, "and it's long overdue." While the trial continued, Isaiah attended another session with Dr. Amelia Pierce. This time, they worked on building Isaiah's confidence. Dr. Pierce asked him to draw what he felt when he was at the park that day. Isaiah sketched himself, small and alone, with a large shadow looming over him. "That's how it felt," he explained quietly. "Like I didn't matter." Dr. Pierce nodded. "That's a powerful image, Isaiah. But let's think about something. Who are the people who remind you that you do matter?" Isaiah thought for a moment before adding figures to the drawing: his mother, his Aunt Renee, and a group of friends standing beside him. That's who you have behind you, Dr. Pierce said. And no shadow is bigger than their love and support. Victor Graham, Harlow's defense attorney, took an aggressive stance during cross-examinations. He attempted to paint the incident as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social media. Isn't it true, Graham asked one witness, that Officer Harlow never physically harmed Isaiah Morgan? Yes, the witness admitted. And isn't it possible, Graham continued, that Harlow was simply trying to ensure the safety of the park? The witness hesitated, but Marcus Turner objected. This line of questioning assumes intentions we can't verify, he said. The judge agreed, and Graham moved on, though it was clear he aimed to sow doubt in the jury's minds. On the final day of testimonies, Danielle took the stand. As a respected judge, her words carried weight, but as a mother, her emotions were raw. Mrs. Morgan, Marcus began, can you describe the impact this incident has had on your son? Danielle paused, steadying her voice. Isaiah is a bright, loving child. He's always been curious and full of joy. But after that day, something changed. He became quieter, more hesitant. He questioned his own worth. She glanced at Isaiah, who watched from the gallery, his hands folded in his lap. No child should feel that way, she said, her voice trembling. And no parent should have to explain to their child why they were treated differently just because of how they look. Her testimony was met with silence, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Marcus Turner delivered a closing argument that tied together the testimonies, evidence, and the heart of the case. This is not just about one child or one officer, he said, pacing in front of the jury. This is about a system that has allowed bias to go unchecked for too long. Isaiah Morgan's story is a wake-up call, and this courtroom has the power to say, enough is enough. Victor Graham, on the other hand, leaned on the defense's narrative. Officer Harlow made a judgment call, he argued. It may not have been perfect, but it was not malicious. We cannot condemn a man for doing his job under difficult circumstances. The jury listened intently, their expressions neutral but focused. As the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Outside, crowds gathered, holding their breath alongside the Morgan family. Isaiah clutched Danielle's hand tightly. What if they don't believe us? He whispered. Danielle leaned down to him, her voice steady. No matter what happens, we told the truth. And that's what matters. Hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson's voice rang out. On the charge of negligence, we find the defendant liable. On the charge of racial discrimination, we find the defendant liable. The courtroom erupted in quiet gasps and murmurs. Danielle hugged Isaiah tightly, tears streaming down her face. Harlow sat silently as the verdict was read. His lawyer whispered something to him, but he barely responded. The weight of the decision settled on him like a stone. For the first time, Harlow seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions not just for himself, but for the boy he had wronged. The jury's decision made headlines across the nation. Justice for Isaiah, a landmark verdict in Fairview, read one newspaper. On social media, the hashtags Justice for Isaiah and accountability now trended for days. For Danielle and Isaiah, the aftermath brought both relief and reflection. That evening, as they sat together on the couch, Isaiah clutched a framed photo of himself playing soccer, a reminder of the innocence that had been shaken but not destroyed. Mama, does this mean everything's fixed now? Isaiah asked, his voice tinged with both hope and skepticism. Danielle smiled gently. It's a step in the right direction, baby, but there's still more work to do. Officer Clint Harlow's dismissal from the Fairview Police Department was finalized shortly after the verdict. He was also ordered to complete community service and mandatory bias training as part of the settlement agreement. At first, Harlow bristled at the requirements, viewing them as an unjust punishment. But during one of his training sessions, something shifted. The instructor showed a series of videos depicting interactions between officers and civilians, including one that mirrored Isaiah's experience. As Harlow watched the reenactment, he saw himself in the officer's actions and Isaiah in the boy's frightened eyes. For the first time, he began to understand the impact of his behavior. After the session, Harlow stayed behind to speak with the instructor. How do you change something that's been part of you for so long? he asked quietly. You start by admitting there's a problem, the instructor replied. And then you listen. Really listen. Isaiah continued attending therapy with Dr. Amelia Pierce, who used creative exercises to help him process his emotions. One afternoon, she asked him to write a letter to the officer. You don't have to send it, she said. This is just for you. Isaiah hesitated, but eventually began to write. Dear Officer Harlow, you made me feel small and scared like I didn't belong. But I know now that it wasn't my fault. It was yours. I hope you learn to see kids like me for who we really are, not what you think we might be. When he finished, Isaiah folded the letter and tucked it into his therapy journal. It wasn't closure, but it was a step forward. With the case behind her, Danielle channeled her energy into systemic reform. She partnered with Captain Denise Walker and local leaders to push for changes within the Fairview Police Department. At a community forum, Danielle spoke passionately about the need for accountability. Justice isn't just about one verdict, she said. It's about creating a system where every child feels safe, every family feels heard, and every officer is held to the highest standard. Her words resonated, drawing support from both residents and city officials. In the weeks following the trial, the park where the incident occurred underwent a transformation. With funds raised by the community, new equipment was installed, and a mural was painted on the side of the nearby recreation center. The mural depicted children of all races playing together under a bright, hopeful sky. At its center was a quote, "Every child deserves to feel safe." At the grand reopening ceremony, Isaiah and Danielle were invited to cut the ribbon. As Isaiah ran onto the field with his soccer ball, the crowd cheered, and Danielle felt a swell of pride. Community reforms begin. Under pressure from both the public and city leaders, the Fairview Police Department implemented a series of reforms. Mandatory bias training. All officers were required to complete annual sessions focusing on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. Independent Oversight Committee. A civilian-led board was established to review complaints against officers. Youth Engagement Program. Officers were encouraged to participate in community events to build trust with local children and families. Captain Denise Walker was promoted to a leadership role, where she continued to advocate for meaningful change. We can't undo the past, she said during a press conference, but we can work toward a better future. As the weeks turned into months, Isaiah began to rediscover his joy. He returned to playing soccer with his friends, his laughter echoing through the park once more. One day, Danielle found him practicing in the backyard. You're getting really good, she said, watching as he dribbled the ball with newfound confidence. Isaiah grinned. Maybe I'll be a pro someday. You already are in my eyes, Danielle replied, her heart swelling with pride. One afternoon, Danielle received a letter in the mail. It was from Clint Harlow. Dear Mrs. Morgan, I want to apologize for the pain I caused you and your son. I've spent a lot of time reflecting, and I realize now that my actions were wrong. I'm committed to learning and doing better. I know I can't undo what happened, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday. Danielle read the letter twice before folding it carefully and placing it in her desk drawer. She wasn't ready to respond, but the gesture gave her a glimmer of hope that change was possible even in the most unlikely places. Months later, Isaiah was invited to speak at a youth leadership conference. Standing on the stage, he faced an audience of peers and adults, his nerves a distant memory. I was just a kid playing soccer, he began. But that day taught me something important. Our voices matter. Even when we're scared, even when it feels like no one's listening, we have to keep speaking up. The crowd erupted into applause, and Danielle wiped away tears as she watched her son stand tall. Years later, Isaiah returned to the park as a young man. Now a mentor for local youth, he often shared his story to inspire others. Standing before a plaque bearing his name, he smiled, remembering the journey that had brought him there. It wasn't easy, he said to a group of wide-eyed kids, but it was worth it, and so are you. Danielle, watching from a distance, felt a profound sense of peace. Together, she and Isaiah had turned pain into purpose, ensuring that their story would continue to inspire change for generations to come. A year after the verdict, the Morgan family and the Fairview community had settled into a new rhythm. Though the sting of the incident lingered, the strides made toward justice and reform were undeniable. Isaiah, now 11, had grown noticeably more confident. His smile was back, and his laughter rang out freely as he played soccer in the park. Danielle watched him from a bench, her heart swelling with pride. She had taken a brief sabbatical from her role as a judge to focus on community advocacy, spending time working with local leaders and families affected by systemic injustices. The transition had been difficult, but it felt right. The changes implemented within the Fairview Police Department were beginning to show results. Officers were seen walking through neighborhoods, greeting residents by name, and attending local events. Captain Denise Walker had spearheaded these initiatives. "Trust is earned, not demanded," she often said. "And we're starting from scratch." The youth engagement program, in particular, became a cornerstone of the department's efforts. Officers coached sports teams, hosted workshops, and mentored children. For many kids in Fairview, the presence of officers at these events felt less like an intrusion and more like an opportunity to connect. Isaiah occasionally attended these events, his initial wariness slowly giving way to cautious optimism. At school, Isaiah's teachers noticed a shift in him. Once quiet and hesitant, he now volunteered to lead group projects and spoke with conviction during class discussions. One day, his teacher, Ms. Peterson, asked him to help organize a diversity and inclusion day for the school. Isaiah embraced the task wholeheartedly, collaborating with classmates to plan activities and presentations. During the event, Isaiah gave a short speech. "It's not about how we look or where we come from," he said. "It's about how we treat each other, and we all deserve respect." His words earned him a standing ovation, and several students approached him afterward, sharing their own stories of feeling unseen or misunderstood. One evening, Danielle received a second letter from Clint Harlow. Unlike the first, this one was addressed to both her and Isaiah. "Dear Danielle and Isaiah, I've spent the past year reflecting on my actions and the harm they caused. I've learned a lot through training and conversations with people who helped me see things differently. Isaiah, I want you to know that you taught me something important. Assumptions hurt people. I hope one day you can forgive me, but even if you don't, I want you to know I am truly sorry. Sincerely, Clint Harlow." Danielle read the letter aloud to Isaiah, who listened intently. When she finished, she looked at her son. "What do you think, baby?" Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "I think it's good he's trying," he said, "but I don't know if I'm ready to forgive him." "That's okay," Danielle said, pulling him close. "Forgiveness is a choice, and it takes time." Later that summer, the city of Fairview hosted a dedication ceremony to celebrate the park's transformation. The newly renovated space now featured a community garden, additional playground equipment, and a plaque commemorating the movement for justice sparked by Isaiah's story. Isaiah was invited to give a short speech. Standing before the crowd, he felt a familiar nervousness but pushed through it, his voice clear and steady. "A year ago, I didn't know how to stand up for myself," he began. "But now I know that speaking up is the first step to making things better. This park is a place where kids like me should feel safe, and I hope it stays that way for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, and Danielle, standing nearby, felt tears prick her eyes. As the months went on, Danielle continued her work in advocacy, mentoring young lawyers and activists. She also helped create a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in social justice. At one of her workshops, a young mother approached her with tears in her eyes. "Your story gave me the courage to speak up for my son," she said. "Thank you for everything you've done." Danielle nodded, her heart full. "It's not just my story," she replied. "It's all of ours, and we have to keep writing it together." Now a middle schooler, Isaiah began exploring his interests beyond soccer. He joined the debate team and discovered a knack for public speaking, often drawing on his experiences to inspire others. One afternoon, he came home and announced, "Mama, I think I want to be a lawyer when I grow up like Mr. Turner." Danielle smiled, pulling him into a hug. "I think you'd be amazing at it," she said, "and I'll be right here to cheer you on." Years later, Isaiah, now in high school, visited the park with his friends. As they played soccer, a younger boy approached him, asking shyly, "Can I play too?" "Of course," Isaiah said with a grin, passing the ball to the boy. From a distance, Danielle watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with pride. Isaiah had come full circle, not just as a survivor of injustice, but as a leader, a mentor, and a symbol of resilience. Danielle often thought back to the day at the park that changed everything. While the pain of that moment would never fully disappear, she knew it had sparked something bigger, a movement that extended beyond her family and into the broader community. And for Isaiah, the experience had shaped him into a young man who understood the power of his voice. As Danielle and Isaiah walked home from the park that evening, the sky painted in hues of orange and gold, Isaiah turned to his mother. "Do you think people will ever stop judging each other?" Danielle placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice full of hope. "I think we can get there, baby. One step at a time." Thank you for watching this story of resilience, hope, and the power of change. If this message inspired you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories that uplift and inspire. Together, we can continue to share voices that matter and work toward a better future. Thank you for being part of this journey.